I want you to imagine something. Close your eyes for a moment. If you can, picture the noise, not just any noise, but a sound so immense it feels like a physical force, the roar of 80,000 people pressing in on you from all sides. Feel the sun, a merciless, blinding white light beating down on the sand. The air is thick, choked with dust, the smell of sweat, wine, and something else. Something coppery and metallic blood. You are standing in the center of the world, the heart of the Roman Empire, the Flavian amphitheater, the Colosseum. And you are a gladiator. In this moment, you are everything and you are nothing. You are a slave, a piece of property owned by another man, your life not your own, but you are also a god. The 80,000 voices are screaming your name. Children play with dolls made in your image. Poems are written about your victories. Noble women fantasize about you. You are a living legend, a superstar. How can this be? How can a man be both a piece of property and a celebrated icon? This is the great paradox of the gladiator, the story of the slave who was worshipped as a star. It's a story far more complex, more brutal, and more fascinating than any movie has ever shown. This isn't just about fighting, it is about what happens when society elevates its most disposable people into its greatest heroes. Let's step onto that sand together and find out. To understand the gladiator, we first have to understand where he came from. The popular image is that of a slave captured in some distant war, thrown into chains and forced to fight. And that's certainly part of the story, a very large part. Prisoners of war, especially from the more martial cultures Rome fought against like the Thracians, Gauls and Germans, were a prime source for the gladiator schools. The infamous ludus, their existing combat skills made them valuable commodities. But they weren't the only ones. The Roman legal system had a particularly grim form of punishment called damnatio ad ludum fei, condemnation to the games. Criminals convicted of serious offences like murder, arson or rebellion could be sentenced to become gladiators. For them, it was a death sentence, but one with a sliver of a chance. Instead of a swift execution, they were given a sword and an opportunity, however slim, to survive, to win, to even find a strange kind of glory in their damnation. Then there were the slaves. Not just prisoners of war, but any slave who was strong, defiant, or simply unlucky enough to be sold by a master to a lanista, a gladiator owner and trainer. For these men, the arena was a terrifying fate, a brutal end to a life already defined by hardship. But here is where the story gets its first major twist. Not all gladiators were forced into the arena. A significant and growing number, especially as the empire wore on, were volunteers. They were called auctorati. These were freeborn Roman citizens, men who, for a variety of reasons, willingly signed away their freedom. Why would anyone do this? The reasons were as varied as the men themselves. Some were former soldiers who knew no other life than combat and saw the arena as a way to continue their trade. Others were buried under mountains of debt, and signing a gladiator's contract was a way to earn a massive sum of money up front, settling their affairs and providing for their families. But for many, the motivation was something more intoxicating, more powerful than money. Fame, they saw the adulation, the glory, the sheer celebrity status of top gladiators, and they wanted it. They were willing to trade their civic rights and risk a violent death for a chance to have their names chanted by the masses to become legends. When a man, volunteer or convict, entered the ludus, his old life was over. He ceased to be a person and became an investment. He swore a fearsome oath, the sacramentum gladiatorium, vowing to endure to be burned, to be bound, to be beaten, and to be killed by the sword. He was now the property of his lanista. The ludus was a harsh and unforgiving world. It was a combination of a prison, a barracks, and an elite athletic training facility. The men lived in small cells, often two to a room. The discipline was iron-fisted, enforced by guards and trainers. Any disobedience was met with brutal punishment. Yet, within this rigid structure, a strange sort of life took shape. The lanista had a vested interest in keeping his gladiators alive and healthy. A dead or injured gladiator was a loss of investment, so, contrary to what you might think, their diet was carefully managed. Archaeological analysis of gladiator remains has shown they ate a high carbohydrate, high mineral diet, rich in barley and beans. They were nicknamed horderieres, or barley. Men, this wasn't the lean, sculpted physique of a modern bodybuilder. It was about building a layer of fat over the muscle. This layer of subcutaneous fat provided a cushion. It meant a gladiator could sustain superficial cuts and wounds that would bleed spectacularly for the crowd without immediately damaging vital muscles or organs. It was a morbidly practical form of protection. Their medical care was also top-notch, arguably better than that of the average Roman citizen. They had dedicated doctors, skilled in treating trauma and wounds. Galen, one of the most famous physicians of the ancient world, served as a doctor at a ludus in Pergamum for several years, honing his knowledge of human anatomy by patching up these fighters. Training was relentless. It began with conditioning, building the stamina and strength required for combat. Then came the weapons training. New recruits, called novici, would practice with wooden swords, the rudis, against a thick wooden stake called a pallus. They were taught by masters, often retired gladiators who had survived the arena and earned their freedom. Every aspect of combat was drilled into them: footwork, parrying, striking, and, crucially, how to die. A gladiator was expected to face his end with courage and dignity. A man who begged for his life was seen as a coward, dishonoring himself and his profession. They were trained to accept their fate, to present their neck for the final blow without flinching. Within the ludus, a powerful bond often formed among the men. They were a familia gladiatoria, a family of gladiators. They lived together, ate together, trained together, and bled together. This created a profound sense of brotherhood and camaraderie, a shared identity forged in the crucible of their violent profession. They understood each other in a way no outsider ever could. They might have to face a brother in the arena one day, but until then, they were all in it together. This brotherhood is one of the most human elements of the gladiator's story, a flicker of warmth in a world of cold steel. So now our gladiator is trained, fed, and part of a familia. He is ready for the games. What was a day at the Colosseum actually like? Forget the idea of two men simply walking out and fighting to the death. The Munera, the gladiatorial games, were a highly structured full-day spectacle of state, sponsored entertainment and violence. The day began with the pompa, a grand procession into the arena. It was like an opening ceremony for the Olympics, but with a much deadlier purpose. The sponsors of the games, often the emperor himself or a wealthy magistrate, would lead the parade, followed by musicians, priests, and finally the gladiators themselves. They would be dressed in elaborate, brightly colored costumes, their armor polished to a mirror shine. They would march around the arena, soaking in the roar of the crowd, a final moment of pageantry before the slaughter. The morning was typically reserved for the Venetians, the wild beast hunts. The Romans went to incredible lengths to procure exotic and dangerous animals from every corner of the empire. Lions from Mesopotamia, tigers from India, crocodiles from the Nile, bears from Scotland, elephants from Africa. These creatures were pitted against each other or against specially trained beast, fighters called venators or bestiarii. This was a spectacle of its own, a demonstration of Rome's power over the natural world. The sand of the arena would be soaked with the blood of thousands of animals before the main event even began. Then came the midday lull, which was arguably the most gruesome part of the day. This was the time for the noxatine, the public executions. Those criminals who were not deemed worthy of even the slimmest chance of survival in the ludus were brought out to be killed in cruel and theatrical ways. They might be thrown to the beasts, crucified, or burned alive. Sometimes These executions were staged as reenactments of famous myths. A prisoner might be dressed as Icarus and thrown from a height, or forced into the role of a hero slain by a monster. This was raw, brutal power on display, a stark warning to the populace about the price of defying Roman law. And then, in the afternoon, came the main event. The moment everyone was waiting for, the gladiatorial combats. But this wasn't a chaotic free for all. Gladiatorial combat was a highly regulated affair, almost a sport. There were referees, or summa ludus, who would oversee the duels, ensuring the rules were followed. They could pause a fight if a gladiator lost his shield or a piece of armor, or if the combatants were locked in a stalemate. The pairings were not random. They were carefully designed matchups between different classes of gladiators, each with a unique set of weapons, armor, and fighting style. This is where the real genius and cruelty of the games become apparent. Each pairing was a tactical puzzle, a clash of strengths and weaknesses designed for maximum entertainment. Let's look at some of the most famous types. There was the Mamillo, the fishman. He was heavily armed and armored, carrying a large rectangular shield called a scutum, similar to a legionary's, and a short sword, the gladius. His most distinctive feature was his helmet, large and crested, often with a fish-like design, which gave him his name. He was a tank, a powerhouse. The Mamillo was often pitted against two specific opponents. The first was the Thraex, or Thracian. The Thraex represented one of Rome's fierce northern enemies. He carried a smaller, square shield, and most importantly, a curved short sword called a sicca. This curved blade was perfect for getting around the edges of a large shield like the Mamillo's. He was less protected, but more agile. The second classic opponent for the Mamillo was the Hoplomachus, who was modeled on a Greek hoplite soldier. He carried a small, round shield, a spear, and a dagger. His strategy was to keep the heavily armored Mamillo at a distance with his spear before closing in for the kill. But the most iconic matchup of all was the one that pitted brute strength against speed and cunning, the secutor versus the retiariuses. The secutor, or pursuer, was a variation of the Mamillo. He had the same shield and sword, but his helmet was smooth and round, with only two small eye holes. This was a crucial design feature. Why? Because his opponent, the retiarius, or netman, was the most lightly armed of all gladiators. The retiarius had no helmet, no shield, and only a shoulder guard, the gallerus, and an arm guard, the manica. For protection, his weapons were a weighted net, a three-pronged trident, and a dagger. His entire strategy was based on speed and entanglement. He would dance around his heavily armed opponent, trying to cast his net. If he succeeded, he could trap the secutor, trip him, and then move in with the trident. The secutor's smooth helmet was designed specifically to prevent the net from snagging on it. This matchup was a perfect piece of theater. It was the fisherman versus the fish. It was speed versus power. It was pure tactical drama, and the crowds loved it. There were many other types as well. The Iks, who fought on horseback, the Isidariuses, who fought from a war chariot, and even the Andabata, who fought blind, wearing a helmet with no eye holes at all, relying entirely on sound. Each fight was a unique story, a physical narrative played out on the sand. Now we arrive at the heart of the paradox. All these men, whether they were criminals, slaves, or volunteers, shared one thing in common. They were legally designated as infames they were, infamous. People of shame, occupying the lowest rung of the social ladder. They had no legal rights. They could not vote, hold public office, or even make a will. They were, in the eyes of the law, social outcasts, on par with actors, prostitutes, and pimps. And yet, these same men were the biggest celebrities in the Roman world. Think of the most famous athletes today. That is the level of stardom we're talking about, and perhaps even more. Their names were known throughout the empire. Graffiti from Pompeii, preserved under volcanic ash, gives us a stunning glimpse into this celebrity culture. We see messages scrawled on walls like, "Celadus the Thracian makes all the girls sigh," or "Cressenes the Retiarius," "the master of the girls, the doctor for the girls at night." They were sex symbols. Their sweat, scraped from their bodies after a fight with a tool called a strigil, was collected in vials and sold to wealthy women as a potent aphrodisiac. Their images were everywhere. Mosaics on the floors of rich villas depicted their most famous fights. Their figures were molded onto oil lamps, carved into knife handles, and painted onto pottery. Children played with clay gladiator dolls. People placed bets on their favorite fighters, forming passionate fan clubs that were every bit as intense as modern sports rivalries. A successful gladiator could also become incredibly wealthy. While most of their prize money went to their lanista, they were allowed to keep a portion. A top-tier gladiator could earn more in a single fight than a legionary soldier earned in a year. Some managed to accumulate vast fortunes. A few rare, exceptional gladiators, after winning many victories, could be awarded the rudis, the wooden training sword we mentioned earlier. This was the ultimate prize. The rudis symbolized their freedom. They were no longer a gladiator. If they were a slave, they were now a freeman. If they were a volunteer, their contract was fulfilled. They could walk out of the arena and live the rest of their lives in peace and often considerable wealth. Some chose to retire, but many stayed in the business they knew best, becoming highly sought. After trainers for the next generation, this superstar status created a bizarre social dynamic. The very same senator who, by law, viewed a gladiator as subhuman might secretly admire his prowess and invite a famous fighter to a private dinner as a guest of honor. The Roman moralists and intellectuals were deeply conflicted about it. They looked down on the games as a vulgar and brutal spectacle. Yet they couldn't deny the powerful grip these fighters had on the public imagination. The gladiator represented a potent combination of virtues that Romans admired: courage, discipline, skill, and a contempt for death. In a society built on military conquest, the gladiator was the ultimate warrior, distilled into his purest, most entertaining form. But let's not get lost in the glamour. We must always remember the grim reality that underpinned it all. The life of a gladiator was, for most, short and brutal. While not every fight was to the death, these men were valuable investments after all. The risk was always present. Death was part of the job description. The famous phrase, "Morituri te salutamus," "we who are about to die salute you," is probably a myth, recorded as happening only once, but the sentiment was real. Every time a gladiator stepped onto the sand, he knew it could be his last. When a gladiator was defeated, wounded, and at the mercy of his opponent, his fate rested in the hands of the editor, the sponsor of the games, who was usually the emperor when the games were held in Rome. The editor would typically look to the crowd for their signal. The crowd would scream and wave, indicating their desire, the famous thumbs-down gesture for death and thumbs-up for life is another Hollywood invention. The historical evidence is murky, but it seems the signal for death was likely a thumb pointed up, symbolizing a drawn sword, while a closed fist with the thumb tucked inside. Pollis compresso may have signified sheathe your sword, and thus mercy. If the crowd and the editor decreed death, the victorious gladiator was obliged to carry out the sentence. There was no hesitation. It was a professional duty, and the defeated gladiator, as he was trained, was expected to accept his fate with stoic grace. He would offer his neck, confirming his courage even in his final moments. The bodies were then removed from the arena in a grim parody of the Grand Pompa that started the day. Attendants dressed as Charon, the mythical ferryman of the underworld, would prod the body to ensure he was dead, while another, dressed as the Etruscan demon of death, would deliver a final mallet blow to the head, just in case. The body was then dragged through the gate of Libitina, the goddess of death and funerals, its journey from superstar to corpse complete. So why did this institution, this blend of sport, execution, and celebrity worship, last for nearly 1,000 years, because it served a vital purpose for the Roman state. On the surface, it was entertainment, a way to keep the vast, often restless, urban population of Rome happy. The policy of panem et circenses, bread and circuses, was a cornerstone of imperial rule. A well-fed and entertained populace was less likely to cause trouble. But the games were more than just a distraction. They were a powerful political tool. By sponsoring lavish games, an emperor could demonstrate his wealth, his generosity, and his power to the people. The Colosseum itself was a political statement built by the Flavian dynasty on the former grounds of the hated Emperor Nero's palace, a gift back to the Roman people. The games also reinforced the Roman social and military order. The beast hunts showed Rome's dominion over the wild lands at the edge of its empire. The executions were a brutal and effective display of Roman justice, and the gladiatorial combats were a continuous celebration of the military virtues that had built the empire. It was a way of teaching an entire population how to watch death, how to face it, and how to value courage above all else. But like all things, the age of the gladiator had to end. The decline was a slow process, driven by a confluence of factors. The empire's crisis of the 3rd century brought economic collapse and civil war. Staging these incredibly expensive games became more and more difficult. The vast machinery required to capture and transport thousands of wild animals began to break down as the empire's borders became less secure. However, the most profound shift was a cultural and religious one. The rise of Christianity brought a new morality to the Roman world, one that preached compassion and the sanctity of human life. Christian thinkers like Tertullian and Augustine vehemently condemned the games as pagan bloodlust and barbaric murder. As Christianity grew from a persecuted sect to the state religion of the empire, its influence began to turn the tide of public opinion. The beast hunts were the first to go, banned in the late 4th century. Gladiatorial combat lingered on, but its popularity waned. The last known gladiatorial games in the city of Rome are recorded as having taken place in the early 5th century. According to legend, a Christian monk named Telemachus leaped into the arena to try and stop a fight and was stoned to death by the angry crowd. The emperor, Honorius, horrified by the monk's martyrdom, was said to have banned the games for good. The story is probably apocryphal, but it captures the spirit of the change. A new world was being born, and the gladiator, that ultimate symbol of pagan Rome, no longer had a place in it. The Colosseum fell silent. The roar of the crowd faded into an echo, and the sand, once soaked with blood, was slowly covered by the dust of centuries. So what are we to make of the gladiator today? He remains one of history's most compelling figures, a symbol of brutal spectacle and a strange, paradoxical form of heroism. He was a slave who could achieve a god-like status. He was a social outcast who was also a cultural icon. He was a man trained to kill for the entertainment of others, who, in doing so, embodied the very virtues his society claimed to hold most dear. And as we look back, it's hard not to see a faint reflection of his world in our own. We no longer have state-sponsored death matches, but our fascination with spectacle, with celebrity, with athletes who push their bodies to the absolute limit remains. We elevate figures from humble backgrounds to global superstardom. We scrutinize their lives, celebrate their victories, and sometimes seem to take a strange pleasure in their downfall. We consume their stories, their triumphs, and their tragedies as a form of mass entertainment. The gladiator is gone, the Colosseum is a ruin. But the human need for heroes, for spectacle, and for the vicarious thrill of watching others live on the edge is as powerful as ever. The echo of those 80,000 voices screaming the name of a man who was both a slave and a star has never truly fallen silent.